Thank you and good morning. Welcome to lecture number 3. The title of this lecture is about the Greek Wars of Independence. So I'm putting in the plural S to highlight that after 1821 and with the creation of the Kingdom of Greece, there was far more in terms of expansion to take place. And it took about 127 years to reach the final borders of what we call the modern Greek state. But before I go into that, last week I mentioned a number of books that certain people were interested. So there were two particular books both by Spiros Vrionis, a very eminent Orientalist and Turkologist, if you like, and it's called The Decline of Medieval Hellenism in Asia Minor and the Process of Islamization from the 11th to the 15th century. At the end of the lecture, I'm happy to give for you to take any photos if you're interested. So that's book number 1. This is actually taught in Turkish universities as well and regarded as a very reliable and eminent piece of work based on archival material from the Ottoman archives. The second book, which is far more controversial, that received a lot of diplomatic pressure not to be printed, was by Spiros Vrionis himself, and it's called The Mechanisms of Catastrophe, and he looks at the pogrom that took place in Constantinople and the expulsion of the 150,000 Greeks that were there, and what were the reasons that took place. Pogroms were usually associated with the Jewish communities, and they were particularly in Tsarist Russia, but this is when the state was involved in the elimination of its own citizens. So these are two publications that may be of interest to you. At the end of the lecture, you're welcome to come and take some photos and pick them up. Allow me to go outside the square today and begin with an event that, if you can hold on till the end of the lecture, we'll come back to it. So I want to go back to 1871 to what we call the Unification of Italy. So I'm raising this topic because I think once we go through this lecture, it may provide some context and some reason for the expansion of Greece. So in 1871, you have basically the northern part of Italy that decides to unify the south. We also have a situation that in the south, for at least 10 years, there is brutal civil war between the Piedmontese of the north and the existing inhabitants in the south. I'll stop there and I will continue the lecture, but let's come back to this because what I'm looking for here is motive. So you have a unification of Italy based on civil wars and the forced incorporation of the south into one kingdom. Okay, let's begin with the first map. So this is a map of what we call modern Greece today, with the exclusion of a number of territories. The Kingdom of Greece, even though it's a bit higher, as you can see, was all this blue area. Now that's 1832, and as you can see, the different coloured areas denominate a particular region. We have Thessaly, we have Epirus, Macedonia, Western Thrace, Eastern Thrace, and we also have parts of Asia Minor, the Deccanese Islands and the Ionian Islands. All these, with time, well, to the large extent, were incorporated into the Greek state. The concept of enosis. So there has to be a reason why a state and its peoples decide to incorporate other bits. For the Greeks, it was always based on the notion of unity or enosis, if you like. There's a C here. What are the criteria that make a peoples seek that unity? One is historical continuity. That's the first thing, historical continuity. The land that I'm on is the land of my forebears, my ancestors, and I'm attached, therefore I'm going to claim it. Second is population. Do I have a strong demographic presence so I can claim that land? In the vast majority of cases, that is not, the first criterion does not apply, particularly in the Islamic context. The indigenous component is not important. As I said last week, what is important, that Islam says you take land but you never give it back, as part of the broader philosophy of Islamisation. Greece is not the only state to have these views. Bulgaria has maintained, and we'll come back to that later, has maintained the view that most of the territories in the north are theirs, based not that much on historical presence, but on the presence of Bulgarians or pro-Bulgarians elements. What we call today North Macedonia makes similar claims on the so-called notion of ethnographic presence and linguistic presence. Albania goes back and says the Illyrians were our forebears and they came right down to this region. Therefore, we can claim, and we will see that during the Second World War, where a number of Albanian groups, the Chasms, were affiliated with the Nazis, and we'll come back to that later. This map here is very rough, so my apologies for that, but it gives you an indication of what I will talk about next, which is the Megali Idea, the great idea. So when the Greek state was formulated in 1830, 1832, that was not enough, because the vast majority of the population was outside that state. It was not within the borders that we know, which is just above Athens and so forth. And there was about 4 million plus Christian Orthodox Greeks located in what is modern-day Turkey, Thrace, and even up in the top in Bulgaria, which is Eastern Rumelia, which was a very, very strong Greek presence that remained until the Treaty of St. Stefano and before 1878. There are two ways in which the Greek state was able to incorporate many of these lands. One was through peaceful cooperation, through exchanges, and the other was conflict initiated. And let's just go through the first. So one of the first territories to be handed over were the Ionian Islands. They were handed over as a gesture by the British to support the then small Greek kingdom, and to also to ensure that there was a presence, but also to block off any Italian presence coming from the north trying to influence the south. So these islands were some of the first that were incorporated as a gift by the British to the modern Greek state. So you have the first expansion, which really takes place about 40 years after. I move on, and we talk about Thessaly. Thessaly in 1881 was incorporated into the Greek state, and it was incorporated as a whole, but there were certain parts of it, like Elassona and Arta, that remained outside on the ground that the Ottomans refused to give those strategic areas. But the incorporation was not based on war, it was based on the Convention of Constantinople. Again, a piecemeal move to incorporate a piece of Greek territory into the modern Greek state. And the Convention of Constantinople in 1881 was as a result of the Eastern crisis, in other words, the rise of the Serbs and the Bulgarians to claim territory against the Turks. As a result of a weaker Ottoman Empire, the British were in favour of seceding this bit to Greece and pushed its borders further up. That countered Russian influence and so forth. So, 1881, we have two large territories incorporated in the Greek landscape, but we still have a very large number of people outside of this area. The rest of the Thessaly is recovered again in 1912, and the region is then occupied in 1941 to 43 by Italy and then Germany later on. So that's a peaceful incorporation. I come to the Dodecanese Islands, and I've jumped here to 1947 because this was part, again, of a peaceful incorporation. So in 1911, the Italy declares a war with Turkey, with the Ottomans, and what it does as a result, it's able to capture the islands down the bottom, I think with the exception of Castellorizo. It captures those islands and it basically holds on to them till 1947. After the war, the Italians being losers and part of the Axis, in a treaty, give the islands back to Greece. All of the 12 islands resort back to Greece. Today, there is a debate in the Turkish parliament about the 12 islands, that they should be demilitarised and reincorporated as part of the former Ottoman Empire. That's a myth, because the agreement was between the Kingdom of Greece and Italy. It was not between, it did not involve the Turkish presence. So that's just a technical matter. I've put down here, but a point that might interest you. In pre-war Australia, around this time, there were a number of brotherhoods being created. One of those brotherhoods was the Rhodesian Brotherhood. In other words, those individuals that came from Rhodes. One of the things that they had, which was in their hearts, and they actioned it, they formed a pan-Australian body called the Pan-Rhodesian Organisation of Australia, and its objective was to promote enosis, union with Greece. Union with Greece. That society was pre-war, and it was extremely philanthropic and patriotic, and they had a branch in every state. Okay, so we'll come back to motive, and we'll come back to the notion of Hellenism and why these people still maintain this note. And the same case, and I'll come back later as a little parenthesis, is the Cypriots did the exact same thing in 1930 in Australia. By 1931, they had brotherhoods like Xenon, whose main objective was enosis, union with Greece. We move on to a very disputed part of the world, and one that has caused much hardship for the Greek state, and that's Epirus. So there are two parts of Epirus that we need to look at. The first part of Epirus is this brown area, and this brown area is what we call modern day Epirus that we know today. That was liberated, and I use the word carefully, liberated in 1912 from the Ottomans. And the north is what we call northern Epirus, what the Albanians call southern Albania. Now, as you can see from the notes that I've put here, most of this territory was contested largely by Albania, which was formulated later, but with the backing of Italy. So what Italy didn't want at the time, did not want a strategic extension in the Adriatic by the Greek state. And that's why you formulated the state of Albania, and this region continuously remained in Albanian hands. By 1913, this territory is won in harsh battles, and the Greeks march into Ioannina, where the Turkish garrison surrenders, and it gives back what we call the southern part of Epirus. The story, however, does not end there. By 1914, the northern part declares itself autonomous and seeks to have its own state, or to be incorporated into the broader Greek state. The defeat of the Greeks in Asia Minor gives Greece very little leverage in northern Epirus and gives a significant more leverage to the Italians at the time, and the part of northern Epirus is never incorporated into the Greek state. The Greek armies marched in there twice. They marched in 1918 and they marched again in 1940, and those territories were never resolved. We also had a situation in 1987, and the then Greek government, some would say naively, others would say proactively, tried their best to protect the minority in what is today southern Albania by ceasing its formal war against Albania at the time. So until 1987, Greece was technically at war with Albania. By doing that, the thinking was that maybe we'll be able to get better outcomes for the 300,000 minority that was there. And they have a history that dates back to prehistory, which I won't go into now. So that gives you a broader picture of Epirus. Now I come to a terror. I didn't put a whole bunch of notes here because I'll just go with the dates. So by 1913, we had a number of territories still in Ottoman hands. Those territories were what we call today's Macedonia, and I'll use the Greek word for that, and Thraci. I didn't say Eastern Thraci or Western Thraci because the concept at the time was that Thraci constituted one particular region, and the Greeks saw it as an integral part of their homeland, for instance, and that goes right down to here. Now, it doesn't touch on Constantinople because the Russians never allowed that to happen. And even today, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus has always been a protected site to allow the passage of ships to come through. And that's why Russian influence was always there, because instead of going from the north, coming all the way down through the Mediterranean Sea and coming in, they wanted to have access to the Black Sea. So no matter how far the Greek state would have gone, it probably would have stayed out of Constantinople unless it was incorporated later. And it's a big mistake that we make, that we think that Constantinople was going to fall into Greek hands automatically. That was not the case. So here's a picture of 1913 and where we stand. Let us begin with the wars of independence in this region. I begin first with 1904 and 1908, what we call the Macedonian Struggle, Makedonikos Agonas. We have about 1.5 to 2 million Christians in that region, of which the vast majority would have been Greek speakers, Slavic speakers, and Vlach speakers. Their ethnicity on the whole would have been Greek, Bulgarian, and a very, very small number that may have been Serbian in origin. I didn't use the word Vlachs, but I used the word Vlach speaking to emphasise the point that linguistic affinity does not necessarily mean ethnic affinity. 1904, we do not have an armed struggle based on armies. We have what we call irregulars. In 1903, the Bulgarians put forth a revolution in what they call Agiou Ilia, which is Illidan, Saint Ilia, and they try in 1903 in the area of Kruševo to overthrow the Ottoman garrison. What happens then is you have a significant rise in armed Bulgarian groups. The Bulgarians were of the view that all this territory, coming down from here, right up to here, with the exception of Chalkidiki, coming around even down to here and coming across the Thrace, is ethnically Bulgarian, based on the Slavic speakers. The Bulgarians delineated population based on linguistic affinity, not on ethnicity. So if you are a Slavic speaker, they saw you as being part of their group. So it's very important to understand their thinking. The Greek population, make no mistake, was alone in 1904 to 1908. In order to counter the Bulgarian bands, what we had the Ethniki Eteria, what we call Pavlo Mela and company, that were able to organise and formulate strategies to counter the Bulgarians. But there were three wars at this time. There was the Turks fighting both those bands, the Bulgarians and the Greeks fighting between themselves, the Serbs fighting the Bulgarians, and the Bulgarians fighting the Serbs. So you have what they call a Macedonian salad taking place. So it's chaos. It's actual chaos. If any amongst you has any notions that the Greek population didn't suffer as the Christians, you'd be very mistaken. These people were alone. Literally alone. And they had to make ends meet against tremendous tyranny. That, of course, does not mean that the Greek bands were not tyrannical and weren't oppressive in certain instances. That was the case. War is war, and that's what it leads to. Particularly in mixed villages, where those villages were supporters of the Exarchate, in other words, the establishment of the Bulgarian Church, as opposed to the Patriarchate, which was in Constantinople and largely represented the Greeks or the Greek faith. 1904, the situation doesn't change. 1913, the region is eventually liberated, and it is liberated by Greek armies moving from down here, going into what is called Ottoman Macedonia, and I'll come back to how and why, and liberating most of this region. The objective, however, of the Greek armed forces was not to go to Thessaloniki, to capture Thessaloniki. The objective was to go to Monastiri, is what is modern-day Bitola in Skopje. And the king at the time was of the view that if we capture Monastiri and come down, we'll be able to create a sphere and the Greek state is greater. So that's option one. Option two, Venizelos, was of the view, no, we have to capture Thessaloniki first because the Bulgarian armed forces are very close, 3 hours out. It's 3 hours. So the Greek armed forces were able to get into Thessaloniki about 3 to 4 hours out and capture the city. And through a letter, Venizelos demanded that the king retreat and come back and capture the city. But this was done, as opposed to 1904 and 1908, not based on irregulars, in other words, armed bands, but a Greek army. So for the first time, we have Greek armed forces taking a stand and liberating territories. And I use the word liberating because that's what it was. The Ottomans were conquerors and those regions were liberated. In today's modern world, we have many terms that pop up to either be politically correct or to be seen to be in harmony with the other. That's mythology. This area was liberated because there were occupiers there. I moved to 1918. Bulgarians again had this notion of a greater Bulgaria, which incorporated Thessaloniki. Their main city of influence was Thessaloniki. They actually had a Bulgarian military club there, and they had many Bulgarian spies, and they had and a significant Bulgarian presence. The Bulgarians picked the wrong side in the First World War, and they moved into what we know, into Macedonia and Thracia. The war is reversed. Greece, Venizelos I should say, decides to fight with the Allies. The king, on the other hand, until 1916, who had a pro-German perspective, and that's not ideological. So he didn't side with the Germans or wanted to remain neutral because he believed that it was an ideological thing. He was part of the royal houses, and there was an alignment by blood, and therefore his argument was to stay neutral. Venizelos opposed that, and in 1916 he creates his own state in Thessaloniki, in other words a quasi-capital where we fight on behalf of the Allies, and as a result Greece is rewarded with the defeat of the Bulgarians, and he captures what we know as Macedonia and Dυτική Thracia. The plot, however, thickens even more later. We come to 1941. Who do we notice on the front door in the borders? We notice the Bulgarians again. The Bulgarians turn up in 1941. The first that turn up are the Germans. The Italians follow after them, after their defeat in Albania, and the Bulgarians enter what we call as Central Macedonia. The Bulgarians are an interesting mob in the sense that they put into place some amazing policies of assimilation, what we call Bulgarization. Greek schools were eliminated, the Bulgarian language was compulsory. They got to the point that they would give foodstuffs out if you declared your affinity as a Bulgarian. We would give you food. Now, only 15,000 citizens took that up. The vast majority of the Greek population did not. This part of Greek history is not as preeminent as the German occupation, but the Bulgarian was much harsher, significantly harsher. It was harsher for another reason, is at the same time what you had in that part of Greece is you had the establishment of pro-Bulgarian bands, some that were called by the name of Ochrana, which was an extreme nationalist group, and what it did, it systematically eliminated villages, Greek villages, to take over and incorporate them into what they thought was the Bulgarian state. The Bulgarians also did one other thing. They took, at that time, what we call Fyrom today in northern Macedonia, and they they were actually welcomed by the population. In Greece they were not, but what we call North Macedonia, that region, they were welcomed because the population there was by far pro-Bulgarian. By far pro-Bulgarian. And they weren't seen as occupiers. Only later, with their maladministration of the region, were they rejected, and so forth. So, that region till 1941 is occupied. 1944, 45, the war virtually ends. But then what you have is you have another cut, another version of the conflict between the Bulgarians and the Greeks in Greek Macedonia. And that was as a result of Bulgaria losing the war, and those who had fought with the Bulgarians and the Nazis changed sides. Many of them changed sides and joined what we call as NOF and SNOF, which was Tito's Slav Macedonian guerrillas. I won't go into any further. We'll talk about that next week. So by the end of the war, by 1949, you have a cleansing of the north, and you virtually have the incorporation of those two states in what is modern Greece today. So its borders are virtually here. I mean, I've jumped one bit, but you'll see it later. So that's where we are in terms of Macedonia. So this was a conflict-based incorporation. They were incorporated based on conflict, not on agreements. And I couldn't see any other way that it could happen. because all three states, the Serbs, the Bulgarians and the Greeks, claimed bits of Macedonia and Thrace on a whole range of reasons, whole range of factors. Thrace. I talked about the Bulgarians when they entered in 1913 because of their distance to what we call Eastern Thrace, what is in modern-day Greece today. That part of Thrace was easily accessible, which meant that the Bulgarians were first to enter, and they did capture that part, and they did incorporate it, but they lost in 1918. And therefore, as a result, under the Treaty of Neuilly, it was re-given back, well, it was reclaimed to Greece, largely because Bulgaria again picked the wrong side. So history can be kind, but it can be cruel. In the Bulgarian psyche today, for many pre-war Bulgarians, this still haunts them, very much so, and particularly the status of Fyrom today, or North Macedonia, that haunts them today. They see that as the child running away from the family and not being part of the Bulgarian state. This here was the flag of Thrace in independence. So we often forget the northern parts, and they were as much revolutionary as other parts of Greece. So that is returned, was always under Ottoman rule, and the reason that was a hard territory for the Greeks to capture, it's much closer to the centre of power for the Ottomans, and that's why Bulgaria was very late in getting its liberation, is because they were much closer to the centre of power with the Ottomans. Constantinople was very close by, and what the Bulgarians tried to do in these regions, the Turks did in Bulgaria. They Turkified large sections of Bulgaria, brought in thousands and thousands of colonists that Bulgaria had to deal with in the 1980s, which soured relationships and so forth. And conversions were very, very high in that part of the world. Sometimes we mustn't look at things always from our perspective. There were strong cases for the Bulgarian expansion in many parts. The issue here is the criterion and the motive for that we have to analyse and discuss. Now, I come to an area that the Greeks continued to claim, but it was outside the borders of the Greek state. Outside the borders of the Greek state. And what I would say is that the areas in yellow are areas where Greeks had a presence from antiquity. 1500 years before the first Turk stepped foot, the Greeks were there. And they were also in what is northern Turkey. And they were also in the heart of Turkey, which is in Cappadocia, which, to my understanding, I don't know whether it's myth or fact, are meant to be the most religious of all the Greeks that have ever lived. Mainly because of their isolation and their affinity to each other. And, as you can see here, Cyprus and so forth. And I'll come back to Cyprus at the end. But look at the map carefully. You don't see a uniformal area that you can control, which meant that you had Greek communities all over the place that weren't easily defended. Briefly, the Greek armed forces in 1918 win. They join the Allies. The Allies, to reward them, say, listen, we'll give you a base in this region here, and we'll allow you to have elections in 5 years and land your army. King Constantine lands there in 1919 in Smyrna. The Greek armed forces come over, the evidence come over, they are heralded, they are welcomed, and when they set foot in Smyrna, the first guerrilla Turkish movements take place. In Smyrna itself. So the question is why? The Ottoman Empire, prior to World War I, stretched right down to here. So why is it in this region that they were able to resist or to defend? Depends what side of history you are. And the reason being is that even though the Ottoman Empire was so large and it was comprised of about 30 million individuals, the Turks themselves were largely concentrated in Anatolia, which is a Greek word, which is eastern. This is where they were concentrated. Around Constantinople, even though Kemal Atatürk, because he despised the Ottoman tradition, moved the capital to Ankara. I think the reverse is going to happen with Erdogan. He's going to take the capital from there to here to make a point. So this is very, very important to understand that the Turks had a strong physical presence in most of what we call Anatolia. And the numbers probably would have been about 7 to 8 million, as compared to the Christians with the Armenians, maybe 2.5, even though, and I use my words very carefully, were massacred from the 1880s by the Sultan. So they started their executions much earlier, and their subcontractors were the Kurds that came later. So we move on. The Greek armed forces land in Smyrna. They are able fairly easily to push right up to here, outside Ankara, about 100 kilometres outside Ankara, at the river Sakarya. Kemal Atatürk was not a fool. He realised that the only way that they'll be able to fight the Greeks is really in a guerrilla war. So his first objective, was to actually fight the Greeks over time and dwindle them down. What did he have? He had at the time manpower. He didn't necessarily have the support of the great allies. Part of what is Turkey was broken up and sliced over to different powers. The Italians had this, the Greeks had that, the French had this, and so forth. But the Turks would have had a state today under the Treaty of Serbs here. That's where their state would have been. The Armenians, under the Treaty of Serbs, had all that, and Kurdistan would have been all that. The Turks didn't stand for that, and Ataturk did not sign or agree with the Treaty of Serbs, and that's why he opted for that. Cutting a long story short, the next scenario is that the Greeks reach the river Sakarya, but they are overextended. They are overextended. In the same way that the Nazis were fighting on two fronts, in the same way that Napoleon was, they are overextended. But in great Greek fashion, you kick your own goal. And let me tell you how they kick their own goal. In 1920, there are elections in Greece. Venizelos loses. As a result, the conservative opposition takes government. They continue the war, but what they do, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not siding with anyone here, I'm just reading it as it is. They continue the internal wrangling that started in 1916 between the king and the liberals, and they replace a significant amount of experienced officers that were fighting on the front. So what happens at the end of the day is you have morale down. Literally, there were no bullets left. There were no bullets left. So the Greeks held on at that line. Kemal Atatürk makes a secret agreement with the Russians to secure their borders. So when we talked about mythology, that the Russians, the Orthodox Russians and so forth, well, they were the first to block off this, kills the Treaty of Serbs, abandons Armenia, the Kurds back off, the Italians withdraw, the British and the French withdraw, then they armed them, because of the state, the Turkish state starts to take hold. The Greeks withdraw in a very horrendous battle. Many historians argue that the First World War ends with this, not in 1918. If the Greek forces were able to hold, because they were the first that withdrew, the situation may have been different. So this is guesswork now. But Ataturk's soldiers were both brave, and they were also heroic in many instances, because they thought they were fighting for a Turkey that they never had. There was no Turkey yet. Turkey could have been this big or this big. Turkey was formalised in 1923 with the Treaty of Lenin. That set the standard. So the Greeks withdraw, they fall back. Then you have, in 1923, the exchange of populations, the compulsory exchange of populations. So the Turks, Ataturk did not want Christian populations to remain in Turkey, what he wanted, what it was then Turkey. He wanted a new republic where it was for the Turks, and we opposed that. Venizelos opposed that. He wanted to be voluntary. So the compromise was, we'll leave the Greek population in Constantinople, about 150 to 200,000, but at the same time, we'll leave the Muslim population in Thrace. Let me define Muslim population. The Muslim population in Thrace is made up of three groups. It's made up of those that identify as Turks. It's made up of those that identify as Bulgarian-speaking Pomaks. And a third group, which are Roma, that identifies. So that population of about 150 has remained. Today, there's 2,500 Greeks. Why? Because of this. So if you get a chance, and Vrionis explains how they were systematically, I suppose, expelled from their birthplaces. And there's still about 180,000 Muslims living in Thrace today, and they're fragmented along ethnic lines. Even though the Treaty of Lausanne doesn't talk about Turks, it only talks about Muslim minority. All right. Conclusion. The great idea dies. The notion of the 5 seas and 2 continents that Venizelos talked about dies. So the Greeks say in 1923, that's it. Our borders are where we're at, with the exception of Cyprus, which I'll come back to later. It's ironic that in 1930, from memory, if I'm not mistaken, or 31, 32, Kemal welcomes Venizelos, and there's a relatively strong coexistence and peaceful coexistence between the 2 countries. And the reason for that is very simple. Both had witnessed war. Both had witnessed war. And they knew that neither could afford a further war in this region. Cyprus. I go back to Enosis. The Cypriots never gave up on the notion of union with Greece. Its geography was a disadvantage, but I think the other disadvantage that the Greek state, another disadvantage from a historical perspective, is that when they sought union, it fell out of the first 2 decades of the 20th century, 1910 to 20. That's when the Greek state expanded. It didn't expand after the 1930s, and it didn't expand in the 60s. It expanded then. So the opportunity for Cyprus to be unified, whether it was by force or whether it was voluntary, in my opinion, lapsed. So why did it lapse? It lapsed for a number of reasons. One, the Ottomans are defeated and begin to disintegrate, and as a result the British jump in, as one does when there are bits of territory to claim, and they take and annex Cyprus. That continues for a while. In 1925 it becomes a British colony. But I said, in 1930 there are rights for union with Greece. In Australia, we have a similar pan-Cypriot organisation in every state trying to promote the notion of enosis. Now, it's interesting to note, and I did this for my PhD thesis, the Greek War Brotherhoods. The very established Greek communities, the Ithacans, the Castellarisians, and the Ithacans, because they had been assimilated to such an extent, were more concerned about other matters. Patriotic issues did not concern them as much. It was these Greeks that still felt an affinity to their homeland that were the ones that would push it, because the Greek communities prior to the Second War were largely controlled by the Kytherans, Castellarisians and Ithacans. They were not the ones that were pushing these causes. It was these brotherhoods and these regional Greeks that created it. And let me tell you, there was about 20 regional brotherhoods that were formed in the 40s and even earlier for the concept of enosis in Australia. We'll come back to the end and talk about Hellenism and so forth. It doesn't happen in 1930. The island is predominantly Greek. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the population of the Turks would have been about 17 to 18%, even though those populations fluctuated in time, and there was a small minority of about 1 or 2% of Maronite or Lebanese Christians living on the island. One other thing I want to say about Cyprus, and we often forget this, is that island, they were the indigenous people. The Cypriot Greeks were the indigenous people. If you argue today about the rights of indigenous, certain sections of our political elites would come out and say, yes, let's support East Timor, let's support the Papuans, which are just and right causes. But very few come out and talk about the rights of the indigenous Cypriots. I go on to also mention something else which sealed Cyprus's fate. 1956, we have the Suez Crisis between the French, colonialists, and the British, and the standover tactics, correctly so, by the United States that tells them back off. You're not going to go back into Egypt and the Sinai and the Levant and retake that area over. That seals Cyprus's fate, because from that time on, the loss of the Suez meant that Cyprus becomes a strategic part of British colonial, strategic and military interests. So they have two bases in Cyprus, even to today. Due to antagonism by the vast majority of the population, by 1960, the protectorate powers, i.e. Greece, Britain and Turkey, have no choice but give independence to Cyprus. But this independence is based on a constitution where the extreme minority can veto everything you do. So you don't have a workable government. Meantime, what you have is you have a sea of blue, largely, which is Cyprus at around 1963. 1960 census, forgive me, 1960 census. As you can see, it predominates in most of the island. And in 1963, you have riots again and internal conflicts. It's interesting to note that when the Turkish invasion took place in 1974, they didn't land down here, they landed here. Why? Because of the concentration of Turkish villages and the demographics of the Turks there. So they landed there that the Turks already had established populations, and they cooperated with them, and they had their own guerrilla forces and so forth. So we come to the I still stay here to 1963, the rights. The British, in the meantime, paint this situation, as they did in Ireland, where they painted the conflict between Protestants and Catholics rather than being an issue of colonisation. They paint this as an intercommunal issue. Yes, there were massacres on both sides. Make no mistake about that. And the Greeks, Cypriots, were not as innocent in many instances, but the others were not. And plus, they were the vast majority, and the notion of enosis would have happened if there was no interest. I mean, Turkey disowned Cyprus, didn't want to have anything to do with it in the early years. It's only later, when their nationalist policies changed, that they had refocused on the region. Now we come to the tragic events of 1974, and a shameful day for the Greek state, who virtually left its fellow Greeks on their own in 1974 because of distance, mismanagement, and a whole range of other facts. So that's a black day in my opinion, and we should say that because there is shame in that. However, I just want to bring up one small thing, and I think it might be worthwhile mentioning it, that the last battles that were taking place against the Turks were not in the Peloponnese, but were at Nicosia Airport. And that was taken over by the 600 heroes of the Cypriots that fought and held the line in Cyprus. So I think we owe Vic and those Greeks gratitude. I just wanted to come back to what I talked about, the unification of Italy. I mentioned the unification of Italy because it really wasn't a unification, it was a forced unification. So the question that I pose to you is that what makes a people struggle for 127 years to reach this state, to reach an expansion of the Greek state, and what makes a people fight between themselves to kick out their so-called brethren? And I think the answer for that is, as we mentioned last week, is Hellenism is powerful, but the ethnos came first and the country came second. So with that in mind, I thank you for your time.